Welcome back here on Live Now from Fox, and you are taking a live look outside the White House over in D.C. as we are now officially 67 days away from the presidential election. On Thursday, Kamala Harris gave her first sit-down interview since her nomination, speaking with CNN. So I do want to talk a little bit more about that interview overall. So let's bring in a friend of the show, Rubino, political analyst and historian, to discuss it all. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us this morning.
You got it, Josh.
All right, Rich, I do want to ask you here, overall, your thoughts. What stood out to you about that CNN interview with Kamala Harris?
That Vice President Harris is trying to move to the center from her presidential campaign back in 2019. You may remember she had a very ephemeral presidential campaign. She, as a matter of fact, dropped out before the Iowa caucuses. But in that campaign, she talked about decriminalizing the border, and she did suggest banning fracking, although she kind of backed away from that in a later debate. She said in this interview from Georgia, she said that she would be in favor, that she would not be in favor, rather, that is, of banning fracking, and she said that there should be consequences for the border. She talked about legislation that she supported that would try to enforce border enforcement, for example. So very interesting. Usually in a presidential campaign during the primaries, the Democratic candidate will move to the left, and then toward the general election, they move to the center. Vice President Harris has the advantage that in this time around, she did not have to move to the left because she did not have a primary, and now she can kind of move to the center. So that's kind of my takeaway from this.
Let's talk about Tim Walz, who was there by her side. What would you say were maybe some of the pros and cons of having her VP pick sitting right next to her for her first interview?
Yeah, he was largely quiet for most of the beginning of the interview anyways. I think that the pros are definitely that you show that there's a team, and that you show, I think, Tim Walz, where his strength is. His strength is certainly for rural voters, for hunters, for example. He, of course, grew up in a very rural part of Nebraska. Ended up serving a congressional district in southern Minnesota that was only one Republican had represented in 100 years. So having him there, I think, is kind of a conduit, if you will, to more moderate and more centrist voters. Now, he obviously, as governor, has been a relatively liberal governor. But if you go back to his time in Congress, he did have some moderate stances. So I think it helped her, just like, for example, Bill Clinton and Al Gore were once interviewed together by Larry King. You had Mike Pence and Donald Trump interviewed together. So it's really Barack Obama and Joe Biden even. So it really has become almost pro forma, if you will.
What question, or maybe even questions, did you hope would be asked of Kamala Harris that weren't?
Yes, and I think the main question is, I think it was more the follow-up questions that weren't unasked. The real question is, when she talks about her child tax credit, for example, where will that money come from, and will it be deficit neutral? I think that's something that she's going to have to answer at some point. It's very easy to kind of make promises and platitudes, and just about every political candidate does that. But when it comes down to it, you have to answer the question in terms of in terms of how you pay for it. And the other thing is, I think the one question that was asked that was asked was if there's any daylight between herself and Joe Biden in terms of wanting a ceasefire in the Middle East conflict. And she basically took the same position as Joe Biden, which is essentially that she supports the continuation of the policy, and that of course is going to lead to many protests. And she's seen that everywhere she's gone so far. I thought that she might distance herself, in part because I was thinking back to 1968, and Hubert Humphrey was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, and he got protested all over the country because of his support for the Johnson administration's prosecution of the Vietnam War. Finally, on September 30th of that year in Salt Lake City, he said, "I support a unilateral bombing halt as an acceptable risk for peace," and the protests stopped. But Vice President Harris has shown that she will continue to support the Biden administration's policy, and will likely get protests in just about every rally she goes to. There'll probably be at least people wanting to come in and heckle her.
And you are a political analyst and a historian, so I have to ask, do you believe that TV interviews like this really sway voters in either direction? Do they have that big of an impact?
It's de minimis. It's very small, if you will. You're talking about very few actual persuadable voters. You're talking about maybe between seven and maybe 10 or 11 states that are actually going to be showdown states this time around. And then you go into those states, there's maybe a little more than 1 million people that are actually persuadable voters. How many of them are watching this? What it is that would persuade them, I don't know. Usually for candidates in this day and age, in such a bifurcated society that we're in, elections are about galvanizing and animating the base, if you will. And I think she probably did not do that because I think certainly her views on Gaza are going to alienate many on the liberal left. That's why there were so many uncommitted voters in Wisconsin and Michigan in the Democratic primary against Joe Biden. And I think her support, her opposition to a ban on fracking will certainly hurt her with some people on the left, and they might go to the Green Party candidate Jill Stein or Cornel West, who's running as an independent party as they try independent candidate as they try to abhor a political vacuum. But she's running to the center. That's what pretty much just about every political candidate does in a general election, and she's trying to get as many of those persuadable voters as possible. It's interesting that her choice of doing the interview was in southern Georgia, and she was in very some center right counties. I did the interview herself in Savannah, but she was in some center right counties. So clearly, she's trying to, if not, she's trying to at least minimize the damage that she would have in places like southern Georgia, where Donald Trump is supposed to do relatively well.
This was her first one-on-one interview since her nomination. She has kind of shied away from cameras overall. I believe she did one kind of gaggle interview where it was like a minute in length. So does that help or hurt Kamala Harris in an election when she's not holding news conferences, answering questions from reporters, and then does one sit-down interview with CNN?
It's a cost-benefit analysis. I think, though, that what she does, she gives, by not doing interviews, she gives fodder for President Trump, for former President Trump, to try to go after her for not doing that. But contrary-wise, on the other side, if she's not doing interviews, if she's in these very controlled environments where she controls it, where she speaks, and if she does do question and answer, she determines who she's going to take the questions from. She's in a lot better position because she can talk about what she wants to talk about in those speeches. She doesn't have to talk about the controversial issues. She doesn't necessarily have to, if she doesn't want to, talk about fracking or talk about Gaza. She can talk about what's very popular, like her child tax credit, for example.
What's on the line for both Harris and Trump as they do take part in this debate, assuming the debate does happen, but we're about 2 weeks away? What is on the line for both of them?
Well, in the one can, they have to be able to keep their bases, and in Vice President Harris's case, the fracking issue, the issue of being against decriminalization of the border, the issue of continuing to support the Biden's policy on Israel, that's something that could hurt her with her base. And in Donald Trump's case, I think that he's really swiggling a line in terms when it comes to abortion rights, because he's somebody who certainly has advocated for the overturning of Roe v. Wade. He's nominated, and the United States Senate has confirmed conservative justices to the Supreme Court and to lower and inferior courts. But I think that he potentially might have an issue because he's now saying that in Florida he does not favor the 6-week ban, which is favored by Governor Ron DeSantis and the members of the state legislature. That's something that could be in the line. That could anger many on the right wing of the Republican Party. But it's all just this kind of just positioning themselves, and they're both trying to kind of run to the center. I think a lot of people didn't think Donald Trump would try to do that, but he is trying to do that. And Vice President Harris has the advantage that she just did not have a major primary challenge from the left in the primaries this time around that would have brought her over to the left.
We know that RFK Jr. dropped out of the race pretty much, and he did endorse Trump. We also have Tulsi Gabbard, who is endorsing Trump as well. Does that help him in any way to have RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard on his side? Is that kind of swaying some of those voters who maybe are undecided?
Yes, well, RFK, I don't think it's necessarily going to be the undecided voter. It's going to be more the disillusioned voter, if you will, the voter that was kind of disillusioned by the entire political process. There's a reason they were drawn to somebody who's a third-party candidate. There's a reason they were drawn to RFK. He's somebody who was very critical of Donald Trump during the election, so it would be interesting the way they campaign that now that they're campaigning together. I think that RFK Jr., he was just like John Anderson in 1980, George Wallace in 1968. They start off, they're in some cases in the mid-teens, and then as most third-party candidates do, when people start to say it's a wasted vote, people tend to believe that, and then eventually they go down to single digits. That's about where RFK Jr. was. So you're really kind of dealing with a very few actual voters who would have voted for him. Tulsi Gabbard, interesting story, somebody who was very much a Democrat when she was in the United States House of Representatives, was one of the chief officers, if you will, at the Democratic National Committee, dropped out to endorse Bernie Sanders in 2016, was very critical of Donald Trump when she ran for president herself in 2020. I think that many of what she became though is she became every Republican's favorite Democrat when she ran for president because she was very critical. I think, though, that it's interesting. One thing that we're at this point now where right's meaning left, and the Republicans have almost become the anti-war party. And one of the issues that Tulsi Gabbard has talked about is she's very much against the neoconservative kind of worldview. And she talks about how Donald Trump has started no wars. That's something that normally you would be attracted to the left wing of the political spectrum. Now the right is really kind of met left on trade and on foreign policy. And it's interesting that Tulsi Gabbard is saying that Donald Trump is really the anti-war candidate.
All right, Rich Rubino, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and break it all down. Anything you want to add about any of this, any political headlines before I let you go?
No, just that this is going to be an absolutely fascinating election, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of debate preparation. Sometimes you can kind of over prepare, sometimes you can kind of under prepare. What I'm interested though, in terms of Vice President Harris, is how many Democrats are going to want to appear with her and how many Democrats are going to try to distance themselves from her. Some Democrats in very swing districts like Jared Golden of Maine have not endorsed Vice President Harris. The same thing with John Tester, who represents Montana in the Senate and for re-election, a state that won 16 points last time around for Donald Trump. They're really kind of have to do a kabuki dance, if you will, to try on the one hand to say that they are supporting of the ticket because they don't want to lose the checks from people who are very much ideological in the Democratic Republican Party. But on the other hand, if you're seen as too connected, too tethered, too alligated to the vice president, it can really hurt you with those very elusive swing voters.
All right, Rich, thank you again for being here with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, greatly appreciate it.